I've muted them. All right. Maybe you're muted on the other side.
I think we had like a little mute button on that screen.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe that's what the issue was. I muted it on the other side. All right. I'll check next time. All right. Welcome to week 2, research methodology. So today I've got a couple presentations we'll run through, and then I will talk to the St. Lucia people about what I talked to the Gatton people about last week that we weren't able to do over the video link. All right, so we've probably got around an hour or so, and then we'll terminate the connection. I'll just work with the St. Lucia people. Okay. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a couple of things. So evidence and research. Research is a way of knowing, and then some things about helping you to develop research questions. All right, let's see if I got this working. So one of the main things about research is, and it doesn't matter what kind of research you do, it has to be something that you have evidence to support your research. All right. Now, when we come to research, it's really not just about what you think, all right, or what somebody else has told you, or even maybe what your supervisor has told you, though a supervisor is a form of evidence that you can use. But you need to have evidence to support your research, and also as you guys are developing a research proposal as part of your assessment in groups, you need to be using evidence to support that proposal. Okay, and we'll talk about that a bit later when we talk about the proposals. So when we're thinking about evidence, I like to think about, to me it helps if you think about in a situation in a courtroom, where we think about evidence and research is quite a lot like evidence in a legal situation. So if you think about someone who's accused of a crime or doing something, then they have to present sufficient evidence that proves that it's more likely, depending on the criteria for proof, but you have to prove that that person actually committed that crime. All right. Now, when we're thinking about research, we need to collect evidence that supports our ideas. All right. And our evidence that we have has different values, different reliabilities. Different types of evidence has different qualities. And in the same way, when we think about legal sense, when they're judging between different evidences, all right, so this person said this person said that, sometimes they might conflict. You have to decide who's telling the truth, whose evidence is more reliable. All right? And it's the same way we have to think about evidence. We might read 2 different papers and they might say different things. We have to say, well, which one is more relevant to the situation we're working in? Which one is more reliable, perhaps, than another one? Okay. So we can judge the quality of the evidence in terms of its reliability to support our research. We can also judge its relevance to our own research. Right? So you need to be thinking about the types of evidence that you have available to support your research, how relevant it is to what you're trying to do, how reliable is it as evidence. All right? So we have different sources of evidence we can use. Now, if we think about different sources, we've got written evidence, so published journals. We've got other people who are working in a research group with us, so maybe postdocs or researchers. We've got other experts that we might consult, like our supervisor. All right? And we have to think about how reliable that evidence is. So, like first call often for you as research students is what we call expert knowledge. So that would be your supervisor, all right, or other academic or research staff, or maybe other research students. Right? So people who have experience and knowledge in the area that you're interested in. Right? So often when you're starting to think about your real research project, when you come to do your MSc research at some point during the next 2 years, You go and talk to potential supervisors, you talk to them about your ideas, they talk to you about their ideas and what research is, and then from that you develop a research agenda, okay? So these are what we call expert knowledge, people who have knowledge in the field. And then if you can think about that, those people also have different levels of knowledge, all right? And their knowledge may be more or less relevant, may be more or less informed. Okay. And then we have published literature. Now, today, usually the problem we find with the published literature is sorting out what's actually useful. I think I might have mentioned to you that when I started in research as an honours student, I did that was in 1984, doing honours. It was actually really hard to get published papers. You know, it took you, basically, you had to get them sent in the mail, usually. Sometimes usually they came in the mail. And so that might take you a couple of months between the writing off a letter, asking someone for a copy of their paper and actually receiving it back. But these days, you know, you go into the library, or you don't even have to go to the library, you just sit in your computer at home, log on to the university library website, get onto a search engine, and you can usually end up with thousands of publications. And so the problem then becomes sorting out what's relevant, what's useful, what's reliable, all right? And so when we look at published information, we have a spectrum of things. From on one side, we have journals, okay, which can be refereed journals, and journals vary in their reliability. And it's one of the things we'll talk to you a bit about later in the publication process. But not all journals are created equal, all right? Some journals are more reliable, they have a better review process, all right? They publish higher quality research, and some other journals will actually take payments from people and publish anything that basically you get paid to publish, all right? So even though it's in a journal, there's different levels of journals. Some have higher editorial and academic standards than others, and you need to consider how relevant that information is to you, all right? Or how reliable it is. So then there's books, there's conferences, there's conference proceedings, there's various reports that you'll see published from government organisations, there's websites, okay? And these have different levels of, I guess, reliability, in the sense that is there any sort of review process? Is there any way of the evidence that's been checked before it's been published? Okay. And then lastly, when it comes to doing research, the last form of evidence that we have is your own evidence that you collect from your own research. All right. And again, for that evidence that you collect from your own experience, in order for it to be reliable and valid and verifiable, you have to document that process. You have to be able to demonstrate that you used appropriate methodologies to collect that evidence, that you have gone through an appropriate procedure, and that your evidence and the information you've collected has been done in an appropriate way, so that that can be used as evidence. The same like in a court of law, you know, there's I don't know if you guys a lot of it overseas, maybe you're not interested in it. There's a case just recently where last week I think was indicated that a case was overturned because one of the person's lawyer was actually giving evidence to the police. All right. At the same time, they were working for the client, and they're not supposed to. The client was giving them information, and they gave that information to the police. And they overturned that case. There was one last week, and it looks like there's going to be a whole lot more, because that evidence had been tainted. All right. It couldn't be treated because it wasn't done in a legal manner. All right. The same way as if you don't do your research in an appropriate manner, we can't use it as evidence. All right. And the standards of evidence and the types of evidence we use depends a lot on the field of research. So not all evidence is equally reliable, and that's your challenge you have as researchers, is learning to sort out what's relevant to your own research, what's most reliable, and what provides the best evidence to support what you're trying to do. All right. So if we're thinking about information to support our research as evidence, this leads us to questions about reliability of that evidence that we're talking about. Sometimes we can think, well, this person has presented this evidence in this way, maybe with other knowledge that we have now. You know, you might look at something that was published 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years ago, and now you have new evidence, new understanding or new evidence. So maybe you could interpret what they have published 5 years ago in a different way in the light of other information that you have. All right. You have to think about whether other sources of evidence you have support that, or extend it, or perhaps refute that evidence. Okay, so sometimes when you look at different forms of evidence, different publications, sometimes they agree, sometimes they conflict with one another. If they conflict, we have to think about, well, why are they conflicting? Can we think of a logical explanation for that? Is it because the research was done under different conditions or in a different place or different methodologies? All right. We have to think about, can we test that evidence in some way? Can we verify it? All right. We have to think about, are there any gaps or inconsistencies in the evidence? Have they left something out? Is there something in the methodology that perhaps would open a question? Were there limitations in the way the study was designed, set up? Okay. So you have to learn to be able to interpret, validate, understand that evidence and make these decisions for yourself as researchers. All right. There's also another issue that comes up, and in statistics they deal with this as, like, they call it a type 1 and type 2 error in statistics. I don't know if you remember this from the statistics, but type 1 error is where you reject your null hypothesis when it in fact was true. Well, that's usually, in the statistics sense, you say all the treatments are equal. All right. So if you make a type 1 error, you say they're different when in fact they're not. All right. And the type 2 error is where you accept the null hypothesis, you say they're all equal when in fact they aren't. All right. Now, if you're thinking about evidence, and so you have to think about how important it is to be right. Now, what are the consequences of being wrong? All right. Now, so for some things it doesn't really matter that much if you're wrong, but other things are actually really important. So if you think about a legal situation, if someone is being, we don't have in Australia, but we don't have capital punishment. In some countries they do. If you have convicted someone and the likely consequences that they're being executed for that, you need to be really, really sure that you're right, don't you? All right. Same way in some types of research, like medical research, for instance, it's important that you don't make mistakes. But, so that's like, so you need to be really careful that you say, you know, if you say this treatment is actually effective, you have to make sure it actually is. Right? So you need to be much more stringent on type 2 errors. Okay? Sorry, accept analysis when in fact it's false. No, type 1 errors. I'm reading this. Type reject analysis when in fact it is true. No, it's the other way. So if sometimes it's really important, like I said, if you're trying to develop, say, a treatment for cancer, and you're making, you know, a commercial sense, you're making claims that this is actually effective treatment, you want to really make sure that you haven't made a mistake, that they actually are different. all right? So you're not trying to, you're not making false claims about your product. In other cases, sometimes it might be really important to make sure you don't miss something, all right? In the sense that that's a type 2 error, when you actually know that something is actually better than your control, and you miss that. And that might be a rare treatment or something that's hard to find. And so if you miss it, that actually has a lot of consequences. So if the consequences of being wrong are really important, then you need to provide more stringent levels of evidence. All right. For me, when I think about, there's still a bit of a debate in political terms about climate change. All right. For me, it doesn't really matter, because the consequences of being wrong. If you think about climate change, if you say climate change is real, and it's not, okay. And so you do something about pollution, you do something about the way we use resources. The consequences of being wrong aren't really that bad. You're not going to destroy the environment. You're not going to cause environmental catastrophes. What you'll do is you'll clean up what we're doing. We'll use more efficient use of resources. We'll change technologies. All right. There might be some economic impacts of that. But if you'd say the other way around, if you say climate change is false, and so we don't do anything about it, and when in fact it is real, what's the consequences of that? It could be dramatic for society. So in those two sides of the debate, consequences of being wrong on one side are much worse than consequences of being wrong on the other side. Right? And there's a lot of things. So you need to think about in your own research. For most of us, we're not doing things which are going to be life-shattering. We're not going to be life and death. But we need to think about, well, what's the consequences if I'm being wrong? What standard of evidence do I need to make sure I adhere to? All right. And in that sense, when we're in statistics, when we often will do some sort of statistical analysis, and then it's a rather arbitrary level. People often accept 0.05, 5% chance of making a type 1 error. All right. Now that may be appropriate. It may not be appropriate. All right. It's a sort of a convention that's been applied over many years, but in some types of research, you might not be happy with a 5% chance of making a type 1 error. All right. You might want a 0.01, a 1 in 1,000 chance of making a type 1 error. Or you might be willing to accept a 10% chance of making a type 1 error, right? Depending on your research. So you need to make that judgment when you actually come to doing your analysis, and not just accept conventions that are generally applied. All right. So your role as a researcher is to evaluate the evidence that you have before you, decide how reliable it is, decide on what levels of rigour you need to apply to that given your particular circumstances. Now, I've put a couple of chapters of the textbook on Blackboard, and I think it's a useful book to read. In this, they talk about research as a way of knowing. Now, when I first read that, I thought, well, that's an unusual way of thinking about things. But when we look across different types of research, the structure and the nature of the way people do research across different fields varies, but nevertheless it has some consistent structures, I guess. So regardless of what type of research we're doing, all formal research has these qualities. It has a systematic approach. It has a set of standards for evidence, okay? And it has a set of accepted methodologies that you'll use in it. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing social science research or you're doing something in the laboratory. Those three things apply. The in each case, we have a systematic approach to collecting evidence to answer our research questions. We have a set of standards in that area that determine what is good research, what is good evidence, and we have a set of methodologies that are accepted for collecting that evidence. Right? And so in whatever field you're working in, you have to learn those things. Right? So the information that we collect through research, regardless of whether we're doing a survey, whether we're doing focus groups, whether we're running an experiment, whether we're doing some sort of comparison longitudinal study, we are collecting evidence for the construction of knowledge. All right? So we collect evidence, we interpret that evidence, and from that we generate knowledge. All right? And so this knowledge that we have is something we construct from evidence, we construct socially, we construct in relation to our peers and other people that are working in the area. Now this maybe you think is a strange thing, that knowledge is something that depends on your worldview. All right? But if you can think about history, you know, of humankind, there was a time in the history of that where everybody knew, this was their knowledge, that, well, at least in Western Europe, that the world was flat. All right? Everybody knew that was true. That was the social accepted standards of the world. That was their worldview, until somebody got in a boat, sailed around the world, and proved that you don't fall off the end of the world, that the world is actually not flat. Right? So, and until that point, that was the way the world was constructed. Okay? It was also a time where people thought that the sun revolved around the earth. All right? But we found that it's the other way around. The earth revolves around the sun. All right? So there was a point, given the evidence and their understanding of the evidence, that they had constructed knowledge in a certain way. All right? So as we collect evidence, we construct that knowledge socially into knowledge. And so knowledge changes, all right, over time. And it's something we construct as scientists with our peers, with other people working in the fields, same fields of endeavour, and something we construct as a human endeavour. All right? So we have evidence and facts on one side, and how we interpret that evidence and facts is what we have as knowledge, what we know to be true, what we take to be true. All right? And that does change over time as we gather more evidence and more information and better understanding about how the world works. All right? So what we know to be true changes based on evidence and based on our social construction. All right? So your role as researchers is to help that process of socially constructing knowledge or new knowledge. All right? So research has a way of knowing. So where do we start? So typically what research commences with is a review of the work of authorities in the field. And from that we can evaluate and synthesise their views together. We normally call this a literature review. All right. Some types of research might only involve a review and analysis of published literature. And some of the students, I think, in this course might only be doing a 4-unit research project, maybe the agribusiness students, I think. And often that's all that's involved in their project. All right? They don't actually go out and collect more information. So we call this, sometimes it's called a desktop study, all right? Where you collect and you synthesise other information from other people's research, and then you create a holistic view of all of that data over a period of time. Okay. It's also possible that you can publish literature reviews, and you'll see when you look at the literature, you'll find a number of reviews, and those are often really good places to start for you guys as students, or many people as researchers. You look at review papers. But when you look at a review paper, just make sure you actually go back and look at the original paper as well. If you read something in a review, you think, well, that sounds interesting, don't necessarily take what they've written in the review as being true. Go back and read the original article, all right? So what we're saying to you, when you're doing your own research, often the primary source of evidence to support that from the literature should be what we call refereed journal articles. Why? Because they've gone through a process of validating the information that's published in those papers. All right? Now, as I said to you before, different journals have different standards on the way they do that. And the question is, well, how do you know that? Well, a lot of that's from experience. But generally speaking, if you look at a scientific or a journal that is refereed, the process that they go through is, like, for instance, if I submit a paper to a journal for publication, they would then send that manuscript out to usually 2, sometimes 3, often anonymous reviewers. Those reviewers will then send their feedback to the journal. The editor then decides, based on that feedback that they receive, that whether they will accept that publication, that paper to be published in their journal. And then usually if they say yes, it's acceptable for publication, then they have 2 options. Usually it's revise and resubmit, or sometimes make minor corrections and resubmit for publication. But usually what you get told is you've got to make major revisions and resubmit your paper and go through the process again. But having said that, it can sometimes be quite challenging, but usually what you end up with at the end of it, after that review process, is something that was better than what you started with. So from my experience, generally, that process of publishing your work through that peer review process generally improves the quality of the work that you publish. All right? So the peer review process is sort of accepted as the gold standard of literature because it's been through that review process before it's actually published. It's gone through assessment by your peers before it's actually put out in the public domain. It can slow down that process, so it means that information is a little bit out of date sometimes, and it can sometimes mean that stuff doesn't get published that should get published, because if you're saying something that's counter to the current view, sometimes it's difficult to get things published. All right? So it can work both ways. It can be a good thing, and sometimes it can be difficult if you're trying to challenge existing paradigms. So again, when you read the literature, sometimes different authorities disagree, or sometimes you can't provide satisfactory answers, and then that leads us to doing your own research. And that's one of the things you need to do when you're developing a proposal. The proposal that you're going to submit is look, whatever the topic that you select, you need to look at the literature and you need to demonstrate that there's actually a gap in the knowledge around that area. All right? So that's actually something you need to find more information out by research. All right? So where the published literature doesn't provide satisfactory answers to the questions, that's when we start doing our own research. All right? The other thing is so in the introduction part of your proposal, that you need to demonstrate there's a need for the research, that the research has value, that there's a gap in the knowledge that can be addressed by research. And then when you come to doing that materials and methods part of the proposal, you actually need to do research to find out how how I can conduct that research in an appropriate way. Because remember we said before that all fields of research have a set of accepted methodologies and standards. And by reading the literature, you can find out what are the appropriate methodologies for you to use, all right? What are the appropriate standards that you need to adhere to. And so research is actually required to find out how to do the research as well. So in the materials and methods part of your proposal, you should be using published literature to provide evidence to support the methodologies that you are proposing to adopt, okay? So it provides you evidence to make sure that you meet the required standards in that field of endeavour, that you're using accepted methodologies, and that your research, such that your research is able to provide evidence that will answer your questions. All right? I think I've got... So in the situation where we haven't got sufficient evidence, or we've got contradictory evidence and we need new evidence, we do research. So we're collecting new evidence from our own research in order to enhance understanding, construct new knowledge. So if we're thinking about that, we need to think about our new evidence that we collect from research. We must weigh that up against existing evidence. Right? So we have to think about how do our research results fit in with the current knowledge. So once we've gone through the process of set up a research project, formulated our ideas, run that research project, collected that evidence, then we need to think in the next stage about, well, how does our evidence compare to existing evidence? How does what we have found here extend existing understanding, or is it supported by the results, or is existing knowledge supported or extended or refuted by what we found out? And we also need to think about, well, how does our research inform avenues for future research? All right, where do we go from here? Given what we know now, what's a logical thing to do next? And the last part about research is always, what do our peers think about our results? And that's where the publication process comes in, where we are communicating our research to our peers and getting their input into understanding of what that research means in that sort of social construction idea. So remember that all research provides a systematic approach, and so that we have reliable evidence to construct new knowledge. In the text, I also talk about research as a discipline, so as a way of knowing, so a way of constructing new knowledge, but also as something we need to learn how to do. All right, and that gives 4 steps in key disciplines that are required to be good researchers. The first one about learning to ask the right questions, another one about honesty and accuracy, and then record keeping, and finally about assessing limitations. So I want to talk about the first 2 of these first. We talked about this a little bit last week about research questions. So frequently we find that there's many questions that we can ask around a topic, and students, particularly when you come to doing your own research project, talk about, your supervisor says, oh, here's a project, you can do this one, and you go, oh yeah, okay, but you don't really understand the full basis of that project and the full conceptual background of it, and so that leads you to an unclear understanding of what the research questions are. But it's really good for you when you start thinking about your own research is to make sure you have a clear understanding about what am I trying to find out from that research, what are the research questions, all right? And that's the first thing discipline you need to develop is learning to ask the right questions, all right? And your supervisor might know that, but it's important that you understand it as well. Because if you don't understand the questions that you're asking, then it's not clear why you're doing the research in a particular way, all right? All right, we did that last week. So if you don't have clear research questions, then what it typically leads to is an inability for you to articulate your objectives of your research. If you are doing an experiment, it means that it's hard for you to articulate what your hypothesis, what you're actually trying to test. That's meaningful. It can lead to poorly designed research in the sense that if you don't know the questions and you design the research, you're not necessarily going to get the evidence to answer your questions because you don't know what you're asking, all right? It can mean that you're wasting resources, wasting time, doing things you don't need to do or not doing things that you should do, and potentially fail to achieve your outcomes. So where you go from here? So part of what you need to do over the next couple of weeks is to develop some research questions. And a good way to start on that process, I find, is to just generate a list. Just start thinking about, you've got a mind map, start thinking about possible questions, all right? Consult other authorities. So you can talk to your peers, other people in class, say, what do you think about this? All right, does that make sense? Is it achievable? Comes to your actual project, you'd be talking to a supervisor, you're talking to other researchers. Ideally, you also should be starting looking at the literature, particularly when you come to writing your proposal as groups. What does the literature say? And as you read the literature, then you can clarify your ideas, review your questions, and come up with a set of questions that are actually meaningful and informative. All right? But the first place, I think a blank piece of paper is often very daunting when you start thinking, write an assignment. I find just start writing down your questions, all right? And then you don't have to submit them all, but unless you start writing something, it's very hard to make progress, all right? I want to just talk to you briefly about plagiarism because over the years we've had a few issues with plagiarism, particularly in this course. Just to be clear, plagiarism is misrepresenting other people's work as your own. So if you copy something that's published and essentially you put it in your assignment, that's essentially misrepresenting the work that someone else has done as your own work, your own ideas. So how do we get around with that? Well, there's essentially three ways. In the context of the work you do here, you're expected to rewrite, not just rewrite or reword, you're expected to take information you get from reading the published literature, think about that and synthesize that and write it in a unique way, something that's new. Right? Not just taking somebody else's words, substituting a few words in there or putting it into some text software online and getting it to rewrite it for you. Because it usually comes out weird when you do that, and we can tell. All right, you're expected to write it in your own words, using your own thoughts. All right, but it's important that if you get information from other people, from the published literature, and the ideas underpinning what you've written come from someone else, then you should acknowledge that by citing their work. All right. So it both provides evidence in the sense that this person found this and this person found this, so it provides evidence, but it also acknowledges the fact that other people's work has contributed to your own ideas. Other ways we can recognise the contribution of others in our work, not so much in your coursework, but typically if you do a research project, then usually, or ideally, you'd aim to publish something from your research project. And so when you publish that, there's two ways you can recognise the contribution of others. One is co-authorship. So if it's a published paper, you know, you got the student's name, and then other people who've made significant contributions to that publication would be listed as co-authors. All right? So that's one way of acknowledging other people's contributions to that work. And the last way we can acknowledge people's contributions is in the acknowledgement section that you often see in papers or in a thesis. When you write your final report, for your thesis, that's a single author report. You can't put your supervisor's name on there. But I would hope that somewhere in there you'd have an acknowledgement section and you would acknowledge the people who've actually contributed to that work in there. So it might be people who've helped you with the field work, it might be people who've provided you advice and support and ideas. You can acknowledge their contributions by doing that. And I don't think that ever hurts you to do that, to accurately acknowledge other people's contributions. It's you end up getting it's a much worse situation if you leave people out and then they won't talk to you or help you or work with you ever again, because they don't feel like they've been adequately acknowledged their contributions. I've put on here, and it's important to have a look at this. I did check it actually works. I don't know if I can copy this here. I'll come back to that, sorry. Lost it. Okay, have a look at that website if you haven't done it already. There's a lot of information there. We might quickly just look at that later if I got time. All right. So what you should be doing now, I suggest you read the first couple of chapters of Born Learning. Think about where you are personally in the research process. Decide what you should be doing next. Read also chapter 3. There's some review questions, and then start thinking about researchable questions for that topic you've selected. Also, so start listing them out, but make sure you have to start thinking about researchable questions within the context of an MSc project. All right, there's no good thinking about a research question that's going to take 3 years to answer. All right, so it has to be researchable in the context of a 1-year project. All right. If you're proposing research that's going to be done in China or in Africa or in the Pacific, you can write that in your proposal, but you have to think, is this practical for a student at the University of Queensland to do for an MSc project? All right. So if you're proposing work that would be conducted, maybe some of you have got previous, work experience in research, maybe you've got contacts back home, and you think, I'd really like to do a project about X. All right, that's possible, but do make sure that that's achievable for you as a student here at UQ. All right. So it may or may not be. What support is available to you to do that? Is it possible? All right. And also remember, when you're writing your questions, research questions, make sure they're questions. So formulated as how, why, what, where type questions with a question mark on the end of it. Don't write them as statements, they're questions, so they need to be questions. I was just going to show you that website because it's got some use. I'll just copy it here. But do have a look at this one. So we'll find a browser somewhere. So is it Firefox? See if it theoretically it should just be able to go there. But have a look at this website. It's got a lot of useful information about plagiarism, and down here it tells you about what plagiarism is. It talks you about referencing, things how to avoid plagiarism. All right. And this is important here. There's also a number of workshops that are available by student services. The library runs workshops, student services run workshops, and these are available to you. And these are there to help you to avoid plagiarism. Things about, they've got workshops on study skills, time management, assignment writing, and referencing. So if you're not sure about what you're required to do, go and have a look at some of these resources that are available to you. All right. Because the consequences can be quite severe. All right. If you're caught cheating, usually you just get a warning, but if you get caught more than once, you can actually be, you can fail the course. Sometimes you can be thrown out. All right, so most people just give them a warning. You can fail the assessment item, which could. All right, so make sure you understand what plagiarism is and how you can avoid that. All right, especially if this is your first semester at UQ. All right, because I understand that you're coming from different places. Sometimes there's different academic practices in different countries, but make sure you understand what's required of you here at UQ, all right? So you don't end up having an interview with the integrity officer and the head of school. So he told me that we were at a meeting last week, and he says that's one of the things he likes least doing is his job as the head of school, is having to deal with integrity matters. So make his life easy by not being there, all right? And we'll all be happy. Okay, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the research proposal. So some background, and this might take a bit longer than I thought. So there's two things here. One is as for this course, you have to, as a group, write a research proposal. So remember that you have to come up with a set of research questions that are interlinked. One should deal with something in biophysical science, something in social science, and a third one, which is your choice. All right, but you need to, what we're suggesting to you is you go through this mind mapping approach and make sure your research questions that you come up with meet those criteria, that they are researchable in the sense they're sufficiently narrow in scope, time and space or conditions so that they can be achievable. Make sure there is evidence that you can collect to answer those questions. And also I suggest you look at this publication which is on the Blackboard site, which gives a set of other criteria which they call the finer criteria, which deal with feasibility, interest, novel, ethics and relevance. All right. So your question should also meet those criteria when you're thinking about the questions that you're asking for your research project. And as we said before, if you can't clearly articulate what your questions are, it's very hard for you to design a project to answer those questions. So when you come to do the group assignment as a group, you guys have to clearly understand what the research questions you are that you're trying to address, and then design the methodologies to answer those questions. All right? So make sure you have a clear understanding as a group of what the questions that you're asking are, and make sure that they are researchable within the context of an MSc project. All right? So I think I've said these things. So the research questions, from that you can determine the primary objectives. What's your research objectives? What is the theory? What are you concepts that you're trying to investigate? What relationships exist between those concepts? What type of data, what type of evidence you need to collect to answer the questions? How should the data be collected? What methodologies that you're using? How should you organise your research in order to provide the required evidence. And lastly, it also should help you understand how that information should be analysed. And this is what you document in a research proposal. Now, why do we use research proposals? Well, I'm actually in the process of writing one, not very successfully because I'm having limited time, but I'm writing a preliminary proposal for funding. If I don't write the proposal, I'm not going to get the funding. All right, so it's a required part of research if you're seeking funding to support your research. All right, all grant agencies require you to write a research proposal. All right, so it's a good skill to learn how to do. All right. It's also typically if students who come in, not you guys who come in as in the coursework program, but if you come in as a research higher degree student, as either an MPhil or a PhD, as part of the entry process, you actually have to write a research proposal. All right, it's quite brief, but there is actually a requirement to write a research proposal to enter into the research high degree program at UQ. So if you actually want to go on and do a PhD by research, you would have to write a research proposal. All right. It's also required for you guys as the starting point for when you actually do your research project. You have to write a research proposal for your own project. All right. So when you come to actually enrolling, you have a supervisor and you start developing your ideas about what you're going to do for your research project. One of the things that you have to do is write a research proposal, all right, for that project. It also provides a basis. I find that the process of writing that out and documenting it provides a very good way of you having a discussion with your supervisors to make sure you both agree on what you're actually going to do and why you're going to do it and how it's going to be done. All right. So by documenting that, it makes it very clear what expectations are on you as a student. All right, and what from your supervisor's point of view. It also helps, this one of writing a proposal and reviewing that with your supervisors helps you to clarify your ideas, clarify your thinking. So it's a useful thing to do. And I said it's an integral part of all research these days. So it provides written documentation of your proposed research, and that could be for implementation, so that once you have agreed upon it, that you go away and do that research. In some cases, it could be implemented by another person. Where I used to work for the government in research, I used to have technical staff that worked for me, and often you would write the proposal. I didn't actually do most of the work. The technical staff actually implemented. So I had to write it, proposal in a way that a technician could read that and understand what was required to do to implement the research. So sometimes you're writing it for someone else to actually do the research. It's good as a reference point because you should document some of these questions about why you did it, how you plan to do it, when's it going to be done, okay? And provides a basis for evaluation and reporting. So again, in a lot of cases where we're doing real research, we write the proposal, and then when we are reporting against that, normally you have to write annual reports, sometimes more often, you report against what you propose to do. All right? You have a proposed set of milestones, proposed set of objectives and outcomes, and then you report against that. And that's, again, is a typical part of most research projects now. And as I said to you, it provides for you as students, it provides an agreed framework between you and your supervisors about what they intend to do. It doesn't mean it won't change, often it does, but at least you have a starting document that you can work from. And it also provides a tool for helping you to schedule activities appropriately, determine what resources you need for your research, what equipment is required, work programs, priorities, and allocation of responsibilities. So it becomes a good planning tool. So for the proposal that you guys are going to develop as a group, some of the things you need to put in there, you'll need to have a title for the project. All right, title should be informative. My personal bias is I don't really like titles that start with a study of, because I already know it's a study, or the effects of, because we're doing a research. If you're doing an experiment, you're usually trying to find out the effects. So try to be a little bit more inventive, a bit more creative about it, and don't waste, you've got 20 words or so to write a title. Don't waste 3 words at the beginning telling me something I already know. All right? Just try to, and it's also, you see a lot of papers written, the effects of, or a study of, and you go, oh, yeah, it's just another one. One of the things that happens is, when people are reading your research, often they read the title first, and if the title doesn't look interesting, that's all they'll read. They'll read the title, then they'll read the abstract, and if that looks interesting, then they'll read the rest of your research. All right? So titles are important. Titles are important when you're submitting project proposals for funding. All right? So if the title, you might have a review panel might have 50 applications to read or 100 applications to read. If you lose them at the title, that's it. So think about your titles. Make sure they're informative. Make sure you're using your words efficiently. All right? You need to have an abstract or a summary, and that should provide a summary of what you're intending to do. Why is this project important? What you're planning to do? What you hope to achieve. All right. It has to have an introduction, and in the introduction, we're expecting you to describe the problem that you're trying to address from research. Why is this important? Why should I care? Why do you need to do this for research? You need to be able to summarise the current state of knowledge around that topic. Okay? So what does the literature say? And clearly identify there is a gap in existing knowledge that must be addressed by research, or can be addressed by research. And then you have to make a statement there, what you're planning to study and why. All right? You should also include a statement of research aims. That's partially in the first thing, what you're planning to do and why. So a research aim is not a list of what you plan to do. It's not saying, I'm going to put an experiment at Gatton, and then I'm going to measure this, and then I'm going to analyse the data, and then I'm going to write a report. All right? Those are not research aims. That's just a list of activities. You need to write what you're trying to discover from research. This research aims to discover the relationship between this and this. All right? A research aim, not a list of activities. All right? And in the introduction, you need to use citations to published literature to provide evidence that we're talking about before, to support the claims that you're making, and to validate and support your research proposal. Now, if you're just in the introduction, so if you're doing something about rice, for instance, you don't need to put a whole lot of general stuff in there that says rice is really important, it's eaten by lots of people, and therefore we should be interested in rice. But, we can take some of those things as self-evident, all right? We're all working in agriculture, and so you need to say, okay, if you're working on salt tolerance in rice, you don't really need to prove that rice is important, all right? So just get into why salt tolerance is important in rice, what's known about salt tolerance in rice, where does your research fit into that general topic of salt tolerance, all right? So don't waste a whole lot of time in your introduction, because you've got a fairly limited amount of space. If you want to say some background things, just limit it to